I was quite nervous for Doris Gets a Job because I knew the second season of the Doris Day Show brought changes, and I had a vague idea of what those changes were, but I really didn't know what to expect. And I will say that it is still good. Of course it is. It's Doris Day. There are some significant differences, but some similarities too, and I'm really hopeful for this second season. Doris Gets a Job is directed by Coby Ruskin, and needless to say, Doris Martin gets a job. And that's not the only change, but I'll talk about the other changes in a moment, I guess with a spoiler warning in case you don't want to know what they are without watching it. But the main narrative focuses on Doris, first of all, going to various job interviews, and then ultimately getting a job. And she gets a job as a secretary in San Francisco for Today's World magazine. And the intro, the title sequence, is actually in San Francisco. I'm assuming it's San Francisco, certainly it looks like it, and Doris driving through it, and it's very different, and it's also a different version of Que Sera Sera. I'm glad they kept that as the theme, but it is a slightly different version, which straight away sets us up for the fact that this is going to be different, because in the first season, most of the footage in that intro is Doris with Billy and Toby. It's got a very family vibe to it, it's very wholesome. And while we still have this wholesome element here, and actually Doris does focus on her children more than her job, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, but it does feel like it's taking a slight step away from the wholesome rural life, and we're getting a look at Doris as the working mother with, the urban-rural balance, and I'm keen to see what they do with that. We do get a good amount of Billy, Toby, and Buck. No Leroy, no Juanita. I don't know if they're going to be in it. As I said, I didn't really know much about this second season, other than I knew the title was Doris Gets a Job, and I also know what happens in a few seasons down the line with the job, but I have no idea what's happening with Leroy and Juanita. And it will be a tremendous shame if they're not in this anymore, because I think they're great characters, but there's another sign that it's shifting focus from her home life to this working mother life, which is I have no problem with. She's perfectly allowed to get a job, especially now Billy and Toby are, getting a little bit older. But one of the reasons I love the Doris Day Show, aside from my love of Doris Day, is that it is homely and comforting, and I think a sign of an easier time. So I am keen to see what that shift is like, but more on that as and when those things come up. But the reason I mention that she still is very much a mother first and foremost is because when she gets this job, she learns from somebody who currently already works there that her prospective boss doesn't like children, and she decides to lie by omission. She does tell him that she's a widow, but she lies by omission in a very clever way of not mentioning her children, but it begins to eat away at her. Will she be able to get on with this job without admitting she has children, or will she finally let it slip? And I won't say what happens with that because it's kind of the main part of the narrative, but it is nice to see that, her priorities are her children, and if she even tries to pretend they don't exist, it's just too much for her. And I think that that's definitely very true to Doris Martin's character. So really enjoyable narrative, great start to the second season, definitely shows that things are changing direction. I'm going to mention a few specifics now. I will also mention the clothing. Big shift in the style of clothing that Doris Martin's wearing as well. When I first saw this, I thought, was this released in the 70s? It was actually 1969, but we are getting into that slightly more 70s fashion, and it's visually a little bit different as well. The house design as well is slightly different. So the narrative style is different, the visual element is different, everything just looks different, although the children don't seem to have aged a day. And the narrative is definitely combining basically everything we know about Doris Martin. She's headstrong, she's determined, but she loves her children. Definitely a strong episode. So, spoilers from now. I'm going to be discussing a few specific things that I found to be quite interesting. And the first one is actually something that happens towards the end, where she says, and I quote, "With 5 you get egg roll." Now, this episode was released the year after Doris's film "With 6 you get egg roll," and I just thought, have you really just plugged your own film in a roundabout way? It just made me laugh. It's not something you would notice if you hadn't seen that film or hadn't heard of it, but it just made me smile. Also, she called Nelson Lord Nelson, and Nelson the sheepdog, their dog, is only called Nelson. Lord Nelson is actually the actor's name. The dog who plays Nelson is called Lord Nelson, but she called him Lord Nelson in this, which it just amused me quite a lot. Definitely a very interesting episode. Very keen to see what happens going forward. Keen to see what happens with various characters. Also, we are introduced to obviously a few new characters with whom she's going to be working on a regular basis, as far as I can tell. And they all seem pretty likable, pretty well developed characters based on their introductions. So I'm keen to see what it's like going forward, and I just hope that it doesn't detract too much from the homely quality of the Doris Day show. But honestly, as long as it's Doris Day, I really don't mind.